So today's practice, we're going to work on color theory or color wheel theory. And so you're going to need this sheet in your packet that has a color wheel that's sort of made out of these triangular shapes. It's going to have some circles down the side, squares, and some other parts to the bottom. Okay, so that's what we're going to be working with today to start the color wheel. Now, it's really important that you follow the instructions all the way through. So it seems really straightforward, like you would just do this and that would be fine. And that's kind of the case. But at the same time, it just kind of changes the instructions a little bit. And so part of your score when you turn this in is, can you follow instructions? And it is totally okay if this takes longer than just one class time for you to complete. And we'll kind of make that decision towards the end of our class. So the first thing that I want to start with is my color wheel. And I just like, because I have a small tabletop space that I'm working with, I turned my paper to the side. You definitely don't have to do that. So I have a cup of water with me. If you're in the studio, you want to fill your water basin, and then I have some paper towels. That way I can rinse my brush out between colors, and since they're watercolors that we're using, I'm also going to have to probably add a little water to the color. So the first thing that I would recommend that you do is, you can see there's these lines and it has yellow, red, and blue. So it's representing our primary colors. So the first thing I would do is fill in those primaries. So I am going to dip my brush in my water, and I'm going to put a little water in the yellow, and I like to kind of let it sit for a moment. And I'm going to put a little water in my red, and I'm going to let that sit for a minute, and then I'm going to put some water in my blue and kind of let that sit. So that way that watercolor soaks. You can use it thin on your paper if you want, or I like a little bit more of the medium amount of pigment, so to speak, and so I'm just let that sit. Now I'm going to start with yellow, and I want to make sure that I'm double checking. So if you look at your color wheel, red, blue, and yellow also have a bolder line. So make sure you start by filling in the right line, okay? And I want you to take your time and try to paint as neatly as you can. So I'm using my square brush, and you have a thin round brush. If you would prefer to use the round brush, you definitely can do that. But the square brush is going to fit pretty nicely into these sort of triangular shapes. And if I just push it on its edge, I can fill that in pretty fast. So make sure you rinse between colors, okay? I know that might be annoying, but it's important to do. And then I like to dab the extra water out. And then I'm going to go to red. So I'm going to rotate my paper just a little bit. And by letting the water sit in the watercolor, I have a much brighter and deeper red. And that's what I want. I'm okay if it's a little bit light, but I want you to try to get pretty true to red, because when we mix our colors, we want to be able to tell the difference between what is the color and what you're mixing it to. So there's my red. I'm going to rotate my paper around, rinse out my brush. And if you're having a hard time rinsing your brush, you can take it to the sink and do a little bit of rinsing there. And then I want to come in with my blue. So really pay attention to where you're filling in those primary colors. If you don't get the primary colors kind of in the right spot, it's going to be really, really difficult for you to fill in the rest of the color wheel. And I really don't want you to have to start over. So it's going to require you to be paying attention while you're doing this. Okay. So I'm going to let those set up and dry a little bit. So now I need to fill in the rest of my color wheel. Okay. And so I know red is here and they're labeled. You're also going to notice there's lines by the other shapes, and that's for the other colors. So one good thing or one way to go about filling in the rest of them is if you look at these three in between blue and red, what is going to be the secondary color? So if I mix blue and red together, I'm going to get violet. And then I'm going to label it for myself. That way I don't forget. Now if I look at yellow and red, if I mix those two colors together, what color am I going to get? And then that goes in the middle. So orange is my color. Now if I have yellow and blue, excuse me, and I want to mix those two together, I want to go in the middle, and that's going to be green. And so I'm labeling it so I know where to put my colors. And I'm just going to work next on the secondary colors. I think it's easier. And so in order to mix it, which is a little tricky with watercolor, is again, I would add a little bit of water to the ones you're going to be using without trying to really get a whole lot of color on to the paints. You're just trying to add water. And so if your water is yucky, you can go ahead and get yourself a new cup right away. So in order for me to get orange, I'm going to get the yellow and I'm going to get that pretty wet. Okay, so I want it to be fairly wet and I want to do this pretty quickly. Okay, so this obviously isn't orange yet, and so I just put some yellow down. And now I'm going to come back with the red and hopefully kind of mix and make that look more orange. Now I can dab my brush off, and I'm going to pull a little bit more of this red off because it's a little bit too red. Then I'm going to rinse my brush before I put it back in my yellow. I definitely don't want to contaminate my yellow. And so then now I'm going to put a little bit more yellow on top of that red. And I'm not being as neat maybe as I possibly could be, but I want you guys to try really hard to do this neatly. So that's one way you could mix the color. And it's maybe not the best way, okay? But it is one possibility. So now I have something that seems a little bit more orange. And I know that in your watercolor pans are most of the colors that you need. But the goal is to try and practice mixing. So right here, it's really yellow. So I'm going to add just a teeny bit of my red. So that's a little bit more orange colored. I know it would be just as easy for me to take orange and fill that space in. But I really want you to try to practice mixing your colors. Now the other way that I can mix the watercolor is in your tool packets. You have this paper copy sheet and it has a waxy surface that's white. So I mix together on my paper. So now I'm going to go over to violet. And so I can take my blue watercolor and put a little bit on my paper. Then I'm going to rinse my brush and I'm going to take some of my red watercolor and I'm going to put it on the paper. Okay, so now I can mix these two together and get violet. So this is a much, much, much easier way to mix your colors. Okay, so now I have violet and I'm going to go ahead and start painting that into my violet. So by mixing it on that other sheet of paper, I now can focus on keeping my triangle nice and neat. I don't have to get it super wet. And if I feel like it might be a little bit too red for violet, I could add a little bit more blue into it. There. That's a better violet. Okay. So I would need to mix the next secondary color and put that in between the yellow and the blue. And I think the best way for you to mix is if you use that extra piece of paper for you to mix your colors just on that paper. Now, since this is just a demonstration, I'm not going to finish the rest of my color wheel, but I do want to point out some things. So it asked me for my favorite color. Well, for me, that's pretty easy. I love blue. I wear a lot of blue. I like blue, dark blue, light blue, blue greens, turquoise, anything with blue in it. I just really like blue. So that's all you have to do is just pick your favorite color. And in your watercolor tray should be a lot of colors, but not all of them. So try your best, all right? So then it says your favorite neutral color. So if you remember back from the Nearpod, neutral colors can be created by mixing complements. So I'm going to take some green, because that's just one example of a complementary color. And I'm going to take some red. And then I'm going to mix them together. So it's looking still kind of reddish. So that means I'm going to take some more green. And then I kind of went a little bit too much green. So I have to adjust the color. And so now I kind of have more of a grayish brown. And my favorite neutral would probably be gray. I can't really make gray because I don't have white in my watercolor set. So by mixing those complements, I made kind of a brown color. And then by not putting it on really thick, I can get kind of a nice charcoal gray. Now, as we get to the rest of this, it's going to be a little bit trickier because when you make a tint of a color, you need to add white. There is no white in your watercolor trays. So what I want you to practice doing is add water. So I'm just going to pick red, and I want to make the first one the brightest red I can. And try to be a little bit neater than I was right there. So if you want to switch brushes, you can. So there's a pretty deep, bright red. So I'm going to take a little extra red over here, and I'm going to add a little water. So from this nice, deep, bright one, because I can't add white, I have to lighten it by using water. So there's a huge difference now between my first circle and my second circle. So I need to add a little bit more red. We shouldn't have quite that big of a jump. Otherwise, what am I going to get to down below? So I'm going to add just a little bit more red. And again, using that painting sheet is going to help so very much. So I'm going to put some more red over here, kind of swish it out a little bit to thin it. And I'm going to put just a little bit more on. So now it's lighter, but not as light as it was. So then I'm going to take some more red, and I'm going to calm down. And I really need to spread it out this time, because it needs to be lighter than the previous circle. So there should be a difference between this one and this one. Well, I don't have much difference going on, so I'm going to add a little bit more red to my top, or my second circle, but I can't add too much because I don't want it to look exactly like my first circle. So I got to be able to see some difference. So right now I have a really bright one, a little bit lighter, lighter, and then this one should be pretty light. So I'm just going to dip my brush into some water and really work out the color. I don't want very much color in there at all. Okay, and then I'm going to take some of the water out so that I can just pull this. Now, if we were using acrylic paints, you would be able to add white, but since we're using watercolor, it's the amount of water. So right now I have really dark, I have a darker value, I have a middle value, I have a light value, and then I have white. So that's how you're going to create the tints with watercolor. Okay? So it's a little tricky, but I think you guys can definitely do that. Now, with shades, in order to create a shade, you know you're going to add black to a color. So the instructions say to use a unique color. At this point in time, I'm going to use red again. You do not have to use red again, all right? You can use a different color. I just have a lot of red out, so I'm just going to use that. So I am going to make kind of a dark color of red there. So it's kind of like regular old red. Then I'm going to go ahead and take some of my red out of my watercolor tray, and I'm going to put that on my paper. All right. Then I want to get some black. So I need to rinse my brush. I want to try to keep the watercolors from getting gross and yucky. And then I'm going to get black. Black is very strong. You don't need a lot of black to change the shade. So I'm just going to kind of put black over here. And I'm going to pat my brush to get some of that black out. And I'm going to take a little bit of the red. See how quickly that turned to black again? So it's better if I just take like a dash. And that's really not working, is it? So I need to rinse my brush. And so now I'm going to take some red and just add very little black. So see the difference there? So if I leave that black in my brush from when I grabbed it, it's going to get too dark too fast. And I'm going to add a little bit more red. So the goal is to try to keep it like even in the amounts that you're adding. But that's tricky, so just do your best. So I know the water has made it appear lighter, but actually the red is a darker red color. And so if I just add a little layer on. So we've got red, my starting color. Then we have red with some black. Well, now I'm going to rinse my brush out again so I don't have too much black in there. It's so strong. Take a little bit more black, and then I'm going to make the color. So if I use too much right away, you're just going to get super, super dark. And we need to be able to see some of the red because we're doing a value change. Okay, so we're making a shade. So then I'm going to put the next one underneath. So I feel like I don't have enough red in it. It looks too black. So I'm going to come in with just a little bit of red. But it should be darker than the previous circle. Okay? So we've got red, darker, darker. And then we're going to get a little bit darker. I'm not seeing much change here. So I think I need to grab a little bit more black. Kind of dab it out to get too much of that out of my brush. Then when I put that on my paper, I don't have a lot of red showing now. It's mostly just black. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of the red. And see how I'm mixing it this time on my paper. So just like with the color wheel, if you need to, you can do some of that mixing on your paper. But I want you to still be able to see some of that red. And then these two look lighter, but this is still darker than this. This is still darker than this. And this is way darker than this. And then my last circle is just black. So that should be very dark. So I went from my color or hue to white to lighten it. And then from here, I have my color, and then I've added a little bit of black all the way down. So that's how you're going to handle tints and shades with watercolor. And it's a little tricky, so don't rush it. Be patient. I want you to try to be as neat as possible, and really having that other sheet for mixing is almost an absolute must. Like I said, I was able to mix a little bit on my paper, but ideally I think it worked best when I had my mixing sheet and I was able to mix. If your paint water is getting really murky, it's always a good idea to switch water out. And so now I want to do monochromatic. So it's saying start with the color in the middle. Now it's saying unique colors. If you just use it out of your paint palette tray, that's fine. If you want to try to mix your own color, you can, but I find that it's going to be just as easy just to use that. So I'm using blue this time. And so this way it says tint. So my last one is going to be a very light color. So I need to lighten it and lighten it. So remember that by lightening, we're adding a little bit more water to our color to make it lighter. But it just needs to be lighter than the first blue that I started with. So hopefully you can see that that is lighter. And then instead of stopping at white, I want you to try to make an even lighter bit of your color. So that means I need to add some more water to it. And that might mean I need to kind of dip the brush out. So I need it to be lighter than the previous one. So I have blue, light blue, and an even lighter blue. So I tinted it. So now on this side, I need to make that a shade. I'm shading it. So remember, black is very, very, very strong. So don't use too much black. And now I need to go darker than the blue. So I'm going to take my black, I'm going to mix it with some of my blue. Wow, that's super dark, way too fast. So now I need to add a little bit more blue. Okay, that's better. And then I want to come in and even though this is like nice and bright, that's just because it's straight blue pigment. This has the two pigments together and I mixed it so this has a little watery, but it's darker. Okay, and then the next one needs to be darker yet. So right now it's pretty similar. I'm going to make it a little darker, get a little bit more black in there. There, it just got messy again. So you want to be careful. I mean, mine isn't ridiculously messy, but I really want you to practice keeping it within the squares. That's helping with your hand-eye coordination. So now, my color's in the middle. I made it lighter by lightening it with water instead of white because of the watercolor, and then lighter yet. And then over here, it's darker and then really dark. So this is kind of that true blue, and then I added black to change the shade of the color. So in the next section, it asks you to mix complementary colors. Complementary colors are across from each other on the color wheel. So the first one says red and green. So first I want to get my watercolors ready by adding a little water to them. And then I want to take some of my red, rinse my brush, and then I'm going to go to the green and bring some green onto my paper so I can mix those together. So it wants me to mix red and green. And I'm trying really hard to get the same amount. So here's my red. I'm going to take my green and I'm going to try to mix the same amount. Now this is not going to be a perfect neutral, so to speak, but it will be the best that you can do using the watercolors. So by mixing the red and the green, my neutral or my brown color actually looks more gray or almost black. And that's the nature of the watercolors. So if we were doing this with acrylic paints, you could get a true neutral brown by mixing complements. Now violet and yellow. I don't want you to get your yellow paint all gross and yucky. So make sure that you're using clean water when you do the yellow. And make sure you don't dip it into the violet first. So here I'm going to put some yellow here. I'm going to wash my brush, trying to keep my watercolors from getting mucky. I'm going to put a little water into my violet, bring that over to my paper, and then I'm going to mix them together. So right now, you can tell I did not have the same ratio of color. There's a lot more violet, so I need to go back in and get more yellow. And try really hard to keep that yellow clean. And I can bring a little bit more violet. So now I have a little bit more equal ratio. And again, it's not going to make you a true brown, but it is going to give you a brown color. And I want you to try your best. Mixing watercolors is tricky. And layering them can work, but I just want you to be careful. So here you can see I have a more neutral gray, almost brown color. Here I have a more neutral brown, but it's a little bit on the yellow side. So maybe that means I didn't quite get it even with my violet mixture. And then the last one is asking me to mix blue and orange. That's the other set of complements. So again, I'm preparing my watercolors by getting a little water into them so I can pull the paint out. So I'm going to take the orange, I'll put it on my paper, rinse my brush, very, very important. Then I'm going to grab my blue, put it on my paper. So I'm going to have about the same amount of each color, and then I'm going to mix them together. So this is probably the most true brown so far that we've gotten. Or actually, it looks almost exactly like the red and the green. But that's because they're complements, and so they're supposed to be creating these neutrals. Now, I can use a little bit more orange, I think. And I'm going to mix it on top so that I do get a little bit more brown. So it's really, really important that you try to get the same amount of each color. And I wasn't perfect while doing that. So this is practice. It's good practice for you to figure out how much is too much. So now we're working with intensity. Intensity is tricky because now we're going to have specific colors we want you to start with. So this wants you to start with yellow. So I'm just filling in the square with yellow. Then it wants me to take my yellow and dull it down with violet. So I'm going to take some more yellow from my watercolor tray, put it on my paper, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab some violet. So rinse my brush out. So in order to get violet, I need to have red and blue. And that's going to give me violet. So right now, this is not a very good violet color. That's more of a red violet. Too much red in it. So I'm going to add a little bit more of my blue to it. Okay. Then I'm going to take some of this and add it to my yellow. So this is more of a brown color. This is telling me that I did a little bit better job with my amount of coloring or mixture of each color. And then now my yellow is dull. And it's not really slightly dulled. It's actually a lot of it dulled. It's dulled to the point of being almost brown. So if I've done it too much, I can come back in with my yellow and go over it just a little bit. So a little bit more of that yellow shows through so that it is slightly dulled. So the next color they want you to use is orange. So I'm going to take my orange, put it on my paper, and then in order to dull orange down, we have to use its complement, and its complement is blue. So I'm going to rinse my brush, grab some blue. And so I'm going to take some of my blue and some of my orange, and I'm going to mix that together. A little bit more orange. Okay. So I kind of mixed it before I filled in my orange square. That's okay. But I'm going to take a moment right now to fill in that orange square. So it says orange is my starting color. Okay. Gonna rinse my brush out so I don't get too much orange in there. And then this is my neutral color that I created from the blue and the orange. And so then I'm going to pick that up and I'm going to put that down. Okay. So the next one they want is yellow green and red violet. So we're using colors that we mixed with our primary and our secondary. So these are the intermediate colors, sometimes called tertiary. So to make yellow green, I need to grab some yellow and some green. So I was going to cheat, so I'm going to caught myself. See how easy that is? Because the colors are right there for you. But I need to mix it, okay? So see, I caught myself cheating. Now I'm going to stop. And I have some yellow. And then in order for it to be yellow-green, I have to have more yellow than blue. So I'm going to take some of my blue, but not very much. And then I'm going to mix it. So now I have green, but it needs to be a little bit more yellow. So I need to get some more yellow. And so now I have a more yellow-green color. So I can use my starting color, my yellow-green, put that in. So see how easy it was even for me to like, oh, well I have that color, why would I need to mix it? Because I want you to practice mixing. And because many of you probably haven't mixed colors with watercolor before, it's a little trickier. It does take a little bit more effort to do that. So now I'm supposed to take my yellow-green and dull it using its opposite or complement, which is going to be red-violet. Well, I have some violet mixed up over here yet, so this time I'm just going to grab some red and add more red to it. So now it's more of a red-violet. Then I'm going to take my red-violet and add some to my yellow-green. And I get quite a bit more of a brown color. So I took this really bright yellow-green and dulled that way down. So basically you're going to have your color and then it's neutralized. And mine are kind of extremes. So if yours end up that way, I'm okay with that. And then the last part is you are going to transition from white to black. Okay? So how you're going to do that again is by using water. So I'm going to get my black ready to go. And I'm going to start by filling this area in. So that's pretty dark. Now by the time I get to the middle, I need to be at 50% gray. So I need to start adding some water. And then when I add that water, I can pull up some of the paint a little bit. So now we went from black to kind of this grayish color. And so now I'm going to add a little bit more water. But it looks basically the same as I'm getting to my 50% gray. So then I need to pull some of that off. So here's my black. Here's a little lighter than black. And then this isn't light enough. So I need to add a little bit more water to it and then pull some of the pigment off. So I'm using the water to kind of pull that off. So now I need to keep going where it's lighter. And I really don't want any lines. I just want to see a color change. And so that's requiring me to kind of swish my brush back and forth. So now I want it even lighter. So I'm going to add some more water. But that's way too much black still in my brush. So I got to pull that up. So right now this one and this one are pretty close. So I can take just a touch more of my black, mix it with some water. And now those are too close. So I need to pull up. And then so here's light. I'm going to add some more water to it. So now I want this really light because the last part of this scale needs to be white. And right now I still have quite a bit of color on there. So I'm going to pull a little bit more. So hopefully you can see some differences between the dark, a little bit lighter, a little bit lighter. You can see my brush strokes. That's a little bit tricky to get rid of when you're using watercolor on paper. So I'm not bothered by that too much. But this seems a lot the same. It doesn't seem different enough. So I have to go back in and make it a little bit darker. It just doesn't seem like it had a good transition. And so that's a lot of color I just added, which doesn't make sense if I'm trying to get lighter. So then I need to use the water to kind of pull that over. And I'm going to pull some of that up. Make sure this is really dark. And I'm going to pull some water out. So now I'm getting a little bit more variation. So now you can see that this is dark, a little bit lighter, 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 and then white at the end. Okay. Now, I said I didn't finish my color wheel because I wasn't going to show you how to continue mixing all of those colors because I wanted to go through the bottom part with you. But there is a middle circle in the color wheel and it says paint this circle neutral gray by mixing all three primary colors. So just don't forget to do that middle circle. And even though in my demonstration today I haven't done all of the color wheel, you still need to. I wanted to just spend some time on how you were going to do tints and shades without having white in your watercolor set, and how that was going to work out for you. So happy painting. Color theory I always think is fun no matter how many color wheels you do. I think it's always great practice for you to figure out how to mix colors, and since we're using watercolor this quarter, it's definitely a lot different than if we were using a different type of paint.